Hello, I'm Professor Lawrence Culver, and my Project History Matters video is What can history and the humanities tell us about federal lands? Federal lands go all the way back to the Revolutionary era. At the end of the Revolutionary War, the original 13 colonies, now states, had competing land claims, and these might even have led to open conflict. So, one of our founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, who would later serve as Secretary of the Treasury and, of course, also a Broadway musical star, suggested something very clever. He said that all the states should give up their Western land claims in exchange for something else they were all dealing with: debt. The original 13 states were already in plenty of debt. So, they signed away their Western land claims, and the federal government assumed all those state debts. After this point, under what comes to be called the Northwest Ordinances of 1785 and 1787, Western lands are surveyed and prepared for sale. This survey system of townships and sections would become the basis for all land sales in the future United States. Regardless of how Western lands were taken, whether they were taken in war or bought as purchases or through cession or treaties or other means, all Western lands now would become federal land. The sale of surveyed Western lands was the single largest source of income for the federal government in the U.S. prior to the Civil War. The government paid for expeditions and surveys of these lands, used them to pay for railroad construction, used them to fund universities, used them as a lure for settlers and development, and used them as reservations for indigenous Americans after signing and breaking many treaties for these same indigenous lands. As one French political scientist noted in the 19th century, the striking and peculiar characteristic of American society is that it is not so much a democracy as a huge commercial company for the discovery, cultivation, and capitalization of its enormous territory. One of those famous expeditions, of course, is the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 to 1806, one of many surveys in the 19th century. Much later, John Wesley Powell authored his magisterial report on the lands of the arid region of the United States. And over time, the surveying and study of Western lands played a key role in the development of government science in the United States, particularly the natural sciences. This survey grid still underlies city and county and state boundaries in the United States and underlies property boundaries in the United States. Get in an airplane and fly over flat places, and you can still see the grid spread beneath you. Here in Utah, the central survey point is at one of the corners of Temple Square, and Salt Lake City, and indeed the whole state, is laid out in relation to that point. Later, by the end of the 19th century, some people in the federal government and in the general public were interested in other uses for federal lands, not purely for sale and revenue, but for longer term management. This leads to the creation of all new kinds of federal lands. So let's talk about those. The first national park created anywhere in the world is Yellowstone National Park in 1872, one of many spectacular places made national parks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Though there was no National Park Service until 1916, prior to that point, most national parks were managed by the U.S. military. The National Forest System dates to the 1890s, when lands were set aside as watersheds. But during the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, he greatly expanded this system, adding 75 million acres to a national U.S. forest system managed by a U.S. Forest Service. The U.S. Forest Service almost immediately was engaged in fighting wildfires. They fought them for all the right reasons, to preserve habitat and scenery and property and human life, but of course didn't understand the ways in which fire was a central part of the ecology of many North American forests, or that indigenous burning was also a long-standing part of those forests. and this has led to a lot of conflict and debates over management of wildlands in the 20th and 21st centuries. Also, during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt, Congress gave him the power to create national monuments by presidential decree. These were intended for small places, places of scenic or historic or scientific value, like, for example, Montezuma Castle National Monument, an ancestral Puebloan site in Arizona. But Teddy, being Teddy, used it for slightly bigger places, like this. He set aside the entire Grand Canyon as a national monument in 1908, which would eventually become a national park in 1919. Later still, in the 1930s, after the catastrophe of the Dust Bowl, another Roosevelt who was president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, decided that this calamity was so vast it was time to reconsider the whole approach to federal lands. He closed the General Land Office, which had been the way any American could buy federal land directly. And instead, the General Land Office was folded into a new entity, the Bureau of Land Management. The Bureau of Land Management oversees 13% of the total land area of the United States. And almost all of that land is land that either was federal land that was never sold because it simply wasn't considered economically viable, or it was sold and the purchasers abandoned it. So at the end of the ecological catastrophe of the Dust Bowl, to prevent anything like that happening again, these lands were pulled from availability to purchase, although they could still be leased for ranching, for mining, and for other purposes too. Not surprisingly, all this federal land has led to tensions with local people, debates over land management, wildlife management, all sorts of other things. And of course, all these places were taken originally from indigenous people. In the Grand Canyon, for example, indigenous people like the Havasupai had used the canyon for many centuries and now discovered that it was a national park where they could no longer farm or hunt as they had for so long. Much more recently, here in Utah, we've seen a conflict again over federal lands at the Bears Ears National Monument, created by President Obama to protect indigenous sites. Its boundaries were greatly reduced by President Trump at the behest of locals and especially energy companies. Those boundaries were rescinded and restored to their original form by President Biden, and now they're likely to be changed again. A reminder of how federal lands and their use and their purpose is something that Americans have argued about and contested since the very beginning of the United States.